Alright folks, welcome back to the channel. Enda call here. Before we get into the episode 3 of the Huddle Breakdown, a few things to say. Obviously this episode was recorded before the 4-1 defeat to Sparta Prague in the Europa League, so that's why that's not referenced at all. We recorded it on Wednesday. And secondly, we lost some of the video in post-edit. My microphone went all wonky, you'll hear it near the end, so we decided to cut the second half of the video. The full second half of the discussion is available in podcast in good quality audio as well. The link is in the description below if you want to continue on watching or listening to the show. The full thing is up on iTunes, on Spotify, on Spreaker, the whole place. So if you're wondering why it only lasts 25 minutes and the podcast is actually 40 minutes, then that's why. It's because my mic goes all wonky, and you'll hear that near the end as well. So decided to cut the second half out altogether, but you can listen to the full thing in the podcast below in the links. So I suppose before we get into that, you have to address this Neil Lennon situation. What's going to happen? Does he deserve to go? I think he absolutely does. I've been on Off the Ball in Ireland talking about it a couple of times yesterday. I just think, club legend or not, it's time to go. It is beyond repair at this stage. He is not coming back from it. The club is in disarray. The players aren't playing for him. There's no shape to the team. All of the data, which we discussed in the Huddle Breakdown over the last couple of weeks, has cemented my opinion that Neil Lennon needs to go. It's not getting any better. It's not improving. And even if you just look at the most basic of basic data in terms of his position at Celtic, compare his last 9 games to Tony Mowbray's and compare it to John Barnes. And John Barnes is widely regarded as one of the worst Celtic managers of all time. He has had a worse 9 run of games since John Barnes. So that is where we're at the minute. I do think a lot of people will be of the same opinion, but if you're of a different opinion, give me a reasoned response why Neil Lennon should stay at Celtic. Not a reason that he's a club legend. A reasoned response backed up by evidence and by data and by an opinion that is anything but Neil Lennon is a Celtic legend, or that Rangers bottled it last season. If you can give me an opinion that is based on fact and can back up that in the comments below, I'll give you a medal, because I don't think there's a person that can do that. So leave a comment below. If you like the Huddle Breakdown, do subscribe to this channel, because I'll be uploading them in full if and when the video doesn't decide to go all wonky. But it's also available on iTunes as well. If you're listening on iTunes, give it a rating, give it 5 stars if you like it, and if you're on Spotify, subscribe to it as well, because it will become a more common thing over the next couple of weeks and next couple of months as well. So I suspect we're going to have a lot to talk about over the next couple of months. So if you like the Huddle Breakdown, do subscribe to it, and thank you very much for everyone who has listened and subscribed so far. So before I start crying about Neil Lennon again, let's get into the Huddle Breakdown, episode 3. And you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. We're on to episode 3 now. It is the podcast that looks at the XG and performance of Celtic. It's not getting any better. We're going to be looking at the Hibs 2-2 draw at the weekend, and looking at the fullback situation. We did centre backs last week, if you want to listen back to that podcast. And we also did the team as a whole a few weeks ago as the very first flagship podcast. So if you want to listen back to any of that, you can find it on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, wherever you get your podcast. We are there. I'm joined on the line, as always, by Juco James and by Celtic by Numbers, aka Alan Morrison. Other way about, I should have said that, but oh well, we're all here. Guys, it's not getting any better. The performances seem to be utterly the exact same as they were over the last couple of weeks before the international break. We've had some breaking news this morning with the Green Brigade turning up to the stadium, unfurling a banner. If anybody hasn't seen that banner, it essentially says "Save the 10, time to go Neil," and they put up a post on their Twitter account as well with a statement from the Green Brigade asking Neil Lennon to step aside and for the board to act now and get someone new in and save the 10 in a row. I'm torn on this. I think their statement pretty much summed up a lot of what fans are feeling, in the sense of they love Neil Lennon, they respect what he has done, they know he is a club man, and it hurts them to ask him to go, but they need him to go, and Celtic really do need that.
Well, if I could, I would just like to welcome the Green Brigade to the Neil McCann conspiracy with me. So I have to make light of things because they're so awful. If I don't try to joke, I start crying. I start weeping just spontaneously. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big deal. I think, I think that the element of the supporters that were staying loyal and really trying to shout down others that were expressing counter opinions over the last few months. I think that group is pretty small now. And it's unfortunate. That's part of what I had talked about back in August and even July about part of my fear about all of this was that if things kind of headed in the direction I was worried that they would, that things could really turn toxic. And I think we're unfortunately seeing that as it pertains to Lennon. And I'm worried it could start transitioning over to Brown as well. And it just shows the importance of proper planning and making good decisions. And, that was one of the issues I had about the risk of this season because of the pressurization of sentiment. People are really dealing with a lot of crap in their lives already. You guys over there going back down in the lockdown, people, life's not real great right now, generally speaking. Personally, our governor just banned alcohol sales again. So I'm having a hard time the last couple of days. Didn't get the stock up in time like I did back in March. So, it's just brutal. And I really fear for what's happening and how toxic this is getting.
I think it is a big deal. I'd agree with you, James, completely. I wonder, I do a speculation, I wonder what the atmosphere in the games and in the ground and around the ground would have been had fans been obviously allowed to go to games. Would things be dragging on as long as they appear to be dragging on? So look, listen, I focus on, as I've said many times, I focus on performance, right? And for all of the sentiment that I have, as much as anyone, for members of Celtic Football Club across the board, and management, players, my question in my mind is always, what are we doing on the field in terms of performance? Is it demonstrably getting better, or can I see signs of improvement? And I think we're going to go on to look at some sort of trends with James in a second, and I think I'll save my comments maybe for responding to that. But there's no good way that this is going to play out. Unfortunately, there's no nice way to do this. There just isn't a positive angle to it, unfortunately. A positive angle, possibly the only positive angle would be something swift and decisive at the board level that would spare things being dragged out and people feeling they had to make these public outpourings of dissent, really, and which is nobody wants, right? But so yeah. But let's get on to the performance analysis, because I think in there the truth will lie.
Yeah, so let's get into the performance from the weekend. 2-2 against Hibs away. Diego Laxalt and Odson Edouard scoring the goals, saving a point for Celtic, and it really was saving a point for Celtic. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can tweet us at Huddle Breakdown as well. We've posted a few stats up there last night. We're going to be talking about the fullback situation in a little bit, but we do want to talk about the performance against Hibs. So from my point of view, anyway, from the weekend, it looked like Celtic went away for 2 weeks. Neil Lennon took the 2 weeks off and literally did nothing to change the shape of the team, the dynamic of the team, and what the team were going to do. Is that what the stats say as well, James? Was it just more of the same?
Yeah, from a top-down perspective, absolutely. The general trend of, and I think some of the charts we'll look at and show on the YouTube broadcast that shows XG differential. So basically what that does is it compares the quality of chances, the aggregate quality of chances, or number. Think of a kind of a simple math equation. Number of chances times the quality of chances equals kind of the overall XG. And then we compare what Celtic did with that side of the equation minus what the opponent did, in this case, Hibs, and that gives you kind of a differential. A minus B equals C. And that number continues to be uncomfortably close to the point where, if you just do basic probability analysis, like a Monte Carlo simulation or something like that, it's a coin flip game of dropping points. So, and ultimately, when we're in the title race, that's all that matters at this point, given the hole that we've dug ourselves and the form and performance levels of Rangers. So, we need to be growing that differential consistently now. The margin for error is almost zero at this point. Or very small. And that's whether you looked at the Motherwell game. This is why Alan always harps on looking at performance levels over results, and what they're predictive about towards. And so basically, the trends that we've seen, and Hibs continued it, is we're not creating enough chances. The quality of those chances, and on average, are quite poor, actually. And then on the flip side of that, we're surrendering too many chances. And on balance, the quality of the chances that we're surrendering are higher than the quality of the chances that we're getting, we're making.
Yeah.
So when you bundle that all up together, that's basically been the problem all season. And game to game, that kind of normal variance, you're going to drop points. And that's where, obviously we've been seeing that.
So let's talk about the quality of chances that we're creating. And one player that you want to focus on in particular is Ryan Christie. A couple of weeks ago, Ryan Christie scored an absolutely stunning goal against Aberdeen in the Scottish Cup. And he does like to take shots from distance and from different angles. And that for you is actually a problem for Celtic at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the romanticism of the game versus stat dorks, right? So no one dislikes a 25-yard screamer that's top shelf, right? Those are glorious. Those highlights are wonderful. But statistically, and from kind of a predictive basis, it's just not a good decision to do it in any kind of volume. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You're looking at a lot of those shots having probabilities of less than 5% to go in on pretty regularly, and a lot of times he's making decisions of shots that are really like 1%, 2% kind of shots. So the game against Hibs was an example where I think he took 7 shots. 5 of them actually were on target, but the aggregate XG was very low. I think it was around 0.2, something like that. So his XG per shot was like 0.03. So you're talking he has to shoot 30 times roughly in order to score on average. And even if he's a little better than average, and I think he is, his track record is he's a decent long range shooter, but the volumes he's taking is the problem. He's leading the team in shooting. He's averaging about 4 shots a game in competitive competitions this year. That's up, by the way, compared to his track record historically. I think his average XG per shot's under 0.08. And again, I looking to benchmark, if I look at players like Arfield, Aribo, or even Haji at Rangers, they're shooting almost 50% less with twice the quality of shots. And if their minutes are different, but if you kind of bundle them up into one player and average it out, they're basically creating the same amount of XG on half the shots. And that's not even factoring in what's going on with, chances that they're creating for teammates. That's purely just their own shooting and decision-making on shots. So the other big thing that that fits into this kind of mosaic is, Christie's been turning the ball over about 14 times a game, between 14 to 15. And that's a pretty high rate. And I think that bleeds into why there's this mixed perception on Christie. A lot of people view him as kind of a volatile player. His decision-making, I think justifiably, is questioned. But risk-taking always has turnovers. I think generally, I kind of read and hear the same thing about Haji from Rangers supporters. Haji's kind of a risk-taker. He turns the ball over a lot too. And so that's kind of built in. But even within that, I think Haji's turning the ball over a little over 11 times per game. Christie's outstripping him by almost 3. Look at somebody like Arfield, he turns it over 8 times a game. So, when you benchmark these things, those long range shots, and he had a couple of them early last year, I think in qualifiers, and then maybe against, I think it was Motherwell or St. Johnston, I forget, early in the season. And then basically he didn't make another one for most of the rest of the season. He kind of clustered 3 within 2 games or something,
right?
And used up all of his probability early. And that's the other thing. That's the problem with variance and sequencing here, is if you do this a lot, you might win a game with 2 of them. And then, like Ferencvaros is a good example. Our decision-making and shot selection in that game was atrocious. So we had our XG wasn't horrible that game, but so much of it was just, excuse my French, crap. Guys shooting from 25 yards through 4 defenders, that kind of thing. Tons of shots blocked, and instead of playing through players and teammates to try and get better quality chances, it's just a high volume of garbage, and that's we come back to this issue of decision making. So I would even venture, even though our differentials are bad, the quality of the XG that we're creating makes that problem even worse because of I keep coming back to this concept of variance.
To sort of supplement that, I mean, it has a place, right? So, for example, during the Invincible season, Celtic scored something, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the numbers. It's been a few years now. Something like 17, 19 goals from outside the box, right? A phenomenal number of goals from outside the box, and we exceeded our expected goals over the season. And so you had a combination of a dominant team with the best players playing a fairly expansive game to quite a well-defined structure, with some key players like Rogic, Roberts, Dembele, Armstrong, all in top form. And the low probability shots were going in far more than you'd expect, and that's how you win an Invincible treble, because there's a lot of factors there that you get right, and by the way, the luck's with you as well, if I could put it that way. Because if you're exceeding your expected goals on long shots over a long period, you're either Lionel Messi or you're lucky. It really is that simple, I would say. I'm being very crude here. So This season, I think, as what James is saying, is we're still trying lots of long shots, but it's not within the context of having control of the game and those long shots supplementing great chance production, because we're controlling the game, we're dominating possession, the ball's going into the box, things are happening there. This is pretty much the sum total of our attack at the moment.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that, Alan. So, if you look at a sport like basketball, one of the main shifts that's occurred that some people don't like, and it's happened in baseball and American football, even hockey to a degree, where analytics has caused a change in strategy fundamentally in ways. In basketball, it's just chucking threes. Run and chuck basically is the dominant strategy now, and even selecting where they shoot from. But the difference there is they get 3 points. Right, there's a probabilistic difference by shooting for 3 points versus 2. Well, Christie shooting from 25 yards isn't 1.5 goals or 2 goals. So, if you see somebody like Seth Curry, who's the Lionel Messi of 3-pointers in basketball, that's why he's a crazy good player, is not only because he's that good from distance, but he gets 3 points for it.
Mm-hmm. But you're also sorry, James, you're also compounding your problems, because if you're shooting from long range, there's a couple of things that are less likely to happen. You're less likely to then get the second ball close to goal, where you've then got another chance against a disorganized, scrambling defense. You're less likely to get a corner, and you're less likely to maintain possession, because a long shot tends to be aerial and tends to be hit with a lot of force, which means it could go, the ball could go anywhere. Whereas shooting from short distance means you're more likely to get a deflection, a corner, some further pressure, some further opportunity, and you reduce all of those aspects as well. But it's interesting what you say about changing the nature of the game, James. I was thinking there about Manchester City. You could almost see it happening in football, because the way Manchester City play is all geared around constructing attacks that result in the ball being cut back into the central area in the middle of the penalty box for a shot at goal. And it would be boring if all teams played the same, frankly, but I don't see that happening.
Yeah, well, when Raheem Sterling scored, I think it was 22, 23 goals in a year, most of them were from the 6-yard box, because
perfect, beautiful. I love that.
Guardiola outlined the problem with Sterling was that he couldn't shoot. So what do you do with a player who can't shoot? You get him into a position where he doesn't need to shoot. He needs to just put his foot in the right position and tap the ball in. And
there's the job for Frimpong. Somebody who's really quick, can anticipate, get into all he has to do is stand get into the 6-yard box at the right moment, because he can't shoot otherwise.
Yeah, so in Ireland as well, in Irish Gaelic football, we've seen a trend as well that James had mentioned we actually have what's called the scoring zone, and the best teams don't shoot outside that scoring zone, because they know that their probability of scoring is far less likely to score outside that zone. So it has become quite boring, quite monotonous, and every team does try and do it. So you don't want that to come into football exactly, but you do want Celtic to be choosing the right shots at the right times and when they're controlling the games. But Alan, you kind of segued nicely into what we're really going to talk about more generally about Celtic, and that's fullbacks. And you have told me to start with the defensive stats because we want to finish with the offensive stats and maybe not be such a I don't know, negative podcast, but it's hard to be not to be negative when the teams are playing so badly. So let's talk about the fullbacks then. We'll start with defensively. So essentially we're talking Greg Taylor, Jeremy Frimpong, Diego Laxalt, and El Hamid as well. So where are you looking at in terms of their performance in XG, and what are we actually looking at before we get into the numbers?
Yeah, sure. So really, again, last week we looked at centre backs, and for defensive performance, we looked at two key aggregated metrics. One was defensive action success rate, which is an amalgamation of defensive actions that are successful versus unsuccessful, and we looked at possession one. So it's defensive actions that result in Celtic maintaining possession versus losing possession. And we showed that actually, if you plot those things, it passes the eye test, and the players that you'd expect to be at the top of that kind of graph, the Van Dijks, the Juliens and so forth, and I are up there, and then in the little corner of sadness at the other end are the people that you'd probably expect to be there. So if we look at the fullbacks again in a similar vein, and to try and sort of really start to build that picture of overall fullback performance, what I've done is I've really used as my benchmark Lustig and Tierney, because I think Lustig and Tierney, I think most Celtic fans would say, were a pretty high benchmark for what a good fullback pairing would be. You had a bit of everything there. You had the drive, aggression, the pace, the attacking intent of Tierney, as well as a very tenacious defender, no nonsense defender, you'd say, did the simple things well from a defensive perspective. And then on the other side, you had Lustig, very experienced, calm, measured, positionally very strong, would fill in any gaps caused by other people attacking, excellent long passer of the ball, but wouldn't sort of bomb up the wing, wouldn't beat people, wouldn't sort of be getting too many crosses into the box. And if you plot fullbacks defensively, what you'll find is that at the top of that graph, really, in terms of defensive capability, is Lustig, and Tierney's not that far behind. And really, if you look at the current crop, you've got El Hamid, who his numbers are a little bit polluted by the fact that he plays a little bit at centre back and a little bit at full back. So you'd expect his defensive numbers to be strong. And then really you're looking at where do the current crop lie? And I think Laxalt is probably somewhere, I would say, in the middle. He's not a Tierney, but he's probably stronger defensively than Taylor and Bolingoli, for example. Taylor is pretty average, actually, much like Bauer was last year. And then in our little corner of sadness down the bottom left, we've really got Frimpong. And actually, Frimpong's defensive numbers are such an outlier that essentially it suggests that you're measuring somebody who plays in a different position, is what I would say. He's too variant from the normal distribution of fullback defensive performances to suggest that even he did actually play fullback, and that actually might be pretty accurate, because he's played in a 3-5-2 a lot as a wing back, and he is kind of learning his trade as a defender, and so it's probably not a surprise to anyone. But what I'd also add is that in general, the fullbacks' defensive performances are down on last year, and I think that's more speaks to structural issues rather than individual performances. And one of the issues that we have defensively, you'll have heard me talk about the concept of packing, and just as a reminder for people new to this, packing is essentially looking at forward passes, and you get credit, essentially. You say you've packed somebody if you pass forward and the ball passes one of the defensive players, goes to your teammate successfully, and you've effectively taken that person out of the game, i.e. they're now behind the ball, and the player with the ball is in front of them and the goal. So that essentially is a good measure of many different facets of play. But if we flip that, the other side of it, which is to say, to what extent are our defenders getting packed? Because you really don't want your defenders being packed. If a defender is suddenly the wrong side of the ball, that's generally going to be trouble. That generally means that if a forward's in space, it means that another defender is probably going to be dragged out of position. And it suggests that the system's kind of broken down a little bit. So you don't want high packing numbers against your defenders. And if you look at the rate at which our fullbacks are being packed per 90 minutes, again, if you look at the sort of, in this case, the low numbers, which are really good, you've got Lustig, who is rarely packed. You're talking about 3 times a game. And Tierney, he was up at 4 times a game, which is remarkable to say how far forward he played. And then if you look at the current crop, you've got at the top, Laxalt and Frimpong for this season. So if you say that, 3-4 times being packed a game is pretty handy, we're happy with that. You've got Laxalt being packed over 10 times a game and Frimpong around 8 times a game. And it's just indicative of 2 things. One is that we've now got 2 attacking fullbacks who bomb forward. And second of all is that means that we're getting exposed. The opposition can now play wide. They can play balls down the channels, and they can take our fullbacks out of the game. And the collateral damage to that is things like Duffy getting pulled out of position, going to have to meet opposition players out wide. That's not his comfort zone. He's not a quick player. He's not a mobile player, and no wonder he's getting exposed when he's having to cover the whole fullback position as well as his own job as well. But what is interesting is systemically, if I move away from the individual performance back to the sort of system again, is that the highest pack rates over the last few seasons of fullbacks, going back to Tierney and Lustig, have all occurred this year. Taylor's being packed more times than he was last season. Frimpong's being packed more times than he was last season. Laxalt's being packed more times than Bolingoli was last season. So that means that not only have we got players in whose nature it is to bomb forward, but the system they're being asked to play is actually inviting that. So defensively, individually, the defensive numbers are going down, and collectively, and not surprisingly, it's being exploited by the opposition.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but for example, of a pack or packing, Jeremy Frimpong for Nesbet's goal at the weekend, would him he didn't really challenge the defender in the air, but that forward headed it on to Nesbet, took him out of the game, and then he was through on goal. That's an example of what packing is.
Exactly. And the collateral damage of that, because now Duffy's anticipating this, is that he's anticipating that Frimpong's going to lose the ball in that area, and actually just the whole system then starts to collapse, right? If you've got 2 out of 4 defenders or 2 out of 5 in a 3-5-2, suddenly out of position, the whole system tends to collapse because other people have then got decisions to make. Do I stay with my man and then just leave this guy? Or do I compensate and then I leave a gap? And it's a horrible set of circle. That's why that defensive shape and organisation is so critical. And it's such a basic thing.
James, your thoughts on the defensive attributes of the defenders, the fullback?
Yes. So I think what's interesting to me, there was some reporting this week by Kieran Devlin from The Athletic on the Cynic Patreon, which I'm a patron. Proud supporter of fan media across the board, myself for years now, and he had mentioned on the Agenda, which is their Monday podcast, about basically his reporting that Lennon had been taking over more control this season. That basically last season was kind of a hybrid as they transitioned away from Rodgers, and that was kind of the Kennedy wing, let's call it, and they kind of had this hybrid approach, and that I think it's not unusual when people under stress start to try to take more control, and certainly there's been a stressful season so far. I can imagine that making Lennon want to take more control. And so that structure that Alan's talked about, where we had, Tierney bombing on and Lustig staying back, it's not there anymore. I mean, we have 2 fullbacks way up high. And, I'm a macro guy, so I hear things 50 different places, and I try to get the, kind of the mosaic as far as what the pieces are fitting together. And, looking at Lennon's track record historically, I mean, he likes his fullback bombing on. And so that to me makes sense relative to what Devlin reported. And, that's the kind of decision making I keep being critical about. I don't understand why we would do that. As we segue into the attacking part of this discussion, and we discussed this, I think, last episode about, in theory, I could understand if those two fullbacks were attacking and putting up elite output in attack.
Yeah.
But they're not. So it's really strange to me that this is the decision-making process. It seems like a rigid ideology almost, regardless of, kind of what's actually happening.
Mhm.
It's like, plan A is this and plan B is do this better. Don't adjust. And it's clearly not working.